Good evening, and welcome to what it turns out is actually the 30th annual Alfred Stiernotte Philosophy Lecture. This is a series that was founded in honor of Professor Alfred Stiernotte, who began the teaching of philosophy at Quinnipiac back about 50 years ago, when it was still Quinnipiac College in New Haven. The series has been held the past 30 years by an endowment established in Professor Stiernotte's memory, in part by his family, supported by other parts of Quinnipiac. And we're very grateful that Professor Pogge has been able to be with us to honor the 30th one. We hope we will do him honor. And we welcome all of you. I will now introduce Professor Anat Beletsky, who will introduce Professor Pogge.
It's wonderful to see all of you here. It's impossible not to succumb to superlatives, real superlatives, when I introduce Thomas Pogge. So first, there's the crazy numbers, astonishing numbers he's written. He keeps telling me not to talk grandly about him, but I feel a real obligation to say, just give the truth. Numbers are just the truth. He's written 11 books. He's edited 17 books. I'll do this fast, Thomas. He's edited 17 books. He's given, I swear to God, 1,022 lectures in 44 countries. He's been translated into so many languages. I love the fact that there's even a part in Hebrew on his website with things that have been translated into Hebrew. For me, the greatest thing is that he has supervised 60 doctoral students, and I think that is such an important part of what we do, supervising doctoral students, getting people who are younger to work with you and learning from them as much as one teaches them. He's got 3 honorary doctorates, and I can go on and on and on with this. But that's just the facts. When you think of the subjects that Pogge researches and teaches, they're very big names, they're labels. You know, you can say Immanuel Kant and John Rawls. Those are, well, some people think that Kant is the greatest philosopher ever. You can argue. Some people think it's Plato. Where's Tim? Okay. Kant. Most people think that John Rawls is or was the greatest American political philosopher. American. The other subjects, when I think of what Pogge works on, the other subjects also have big names. We talk about political philosophy, we talk about ethics and theories of morals, we talk about global justice, we talk about justice in healthcare. These are big labels. But I think that it's the titles of his books and articles that make me feel the attitude that Pogge gives, the attitude that Pogge carries vis-a-vis philosophy. And I want to read just some of those titles so you'll get that same whiff. Realizing Rawls was the first book, but then there's Politics as Usual, which is, I think, the last book. Realizing Rawls and Politics as Usual. There's something called Who Owes What to the Very Poor? Why academics should join to stand against poverty, allowing the poor to share the earth, how not to count the poor, achieving democracy, medicines for the world, what do we share and who are we anyway, what can we reasonably reject, and my favorite, loopholes in morality, or loopholes in moralities, and this from a philosopher. So what I'd like to talk about actually, and I'll be really short, is that we're used to talking about academia under 3 labels: teaching, research, and service. I think that Pogge for me is the ultimate example of why and how service comes first, or should come first, in that threesome of criteria for academic excellence. Beyond what we always talk about, service to the department, service to the school, service to the university, service to the profession. We all know how to fill in those criteria. Pogge does service born of philosophy to the community of humankind. And it's not for naught that he is chair of all sorts of organizations, all concrete institutions, all concrete contexts in which real people work, not just academics. The two organizations that I always think of are ASAP, which is Academic Stand Against Poverty, and the Health Impact Fund. I think we'll probably hear about some of them here today. What Pogge does is take philosophical knowledge and wisdom and expertise and put them to work. I think what Pogge has done is take philosophy from that top floor of the ivory tower and bring it down to the ground for a real moral life. So it gives me great honor and greater pleasure, or I don't know, maybe great pleasure and greater honor, to welcome Thomas Pogge to give us the Stiernotte talk on designing for human rights, food, health, and climate. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Anat, for exaggerating so nicely. And this is about designing for human rights, food, health, and climate. So let's start with human progress. Human progress is something that we all cherish, and it depends on two interlinked components. On the one hand, we need innovation, and on the other hand, we also need diffusion. So innovation by itself is no good if it doesn't reach people, if the innovation doesn't actually get disseminated or taken up. And of course, nothing can be diffused if there is no innovation. So we always need both components. If one component is stifled, progress will not happen, will be impeded. Now, there is a fundamental dilemma in this area of innovation and diffusion, and that is that we have, in the moment, learned to stimulate innovation in ways that undermine diffusion. We've learned that the speed and quality of innovation can be enhanced if we grant innovators temporary monopolies, patents, copyrights, and so on, that allow them to profit by charging high prices without having to worry about competition from others. So that's nice. That gets us more innovation, better innovation, faster innovation. But the problem is then that high prices also hamper diffusion. So the higher the price is, the fewer people can access the innovation or will access the innovation. And so we win in the area of innovation, but we lose in the area of diffusion. So that's a fundamental dilemma, fundamental paradox, and that's going to be central to what I will talk about today. And I want to first illustrate this problem in regard to pharmaceuticals, to medicines, where it's maybe at its most urgent and most pernicious or destructive. So what we have now is a system that was essentially instituted in the mid-1990s together with the World Trade Organization, namely a system where all the countries that are members of the WTO have to grant pharmaceutical innovators 20-year patents on new medicines. So these patents have to be available at least 20 years, and they have to be product patents. To give you a sense of what the preceding regulation was, India, maybe the most important country for producing pharmaceuticals in the world, had 7-year process patents before 2005. They came under the agreement or had to comply as of 1st of January 2005. Now, a process patent basically protects a certain way of making a medicine. So if a generic company can find another way of making the same molecule, it does not violate the patent in doing so. And Indian companies were actually quite good at finding other ways of making the same molecule. And so selling cheaply to Indian customers and the rest of the world medicines that were still under patent, but under process patent for 7 years. So now we have product patents everywhere in the world, in all WTO member states, and they protect the molecule itself. So it doesn't matter how you make the molecule. If somebody else owns the patent, you cannot make it and you cannot sell it. and they last for 20 years from the time of filing a patent application. So that's the current system. It was put into the World Trade Organization founding treaty, and the name of this particular sub-agreement is the TRIPS Agreement, Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. So this status quo has various drawbacks. And the first and most obvious drawback is that it hampers access, it hampers diffusion. So new medicines come onto the market. Only one company, namely the inventor company that holds the patent, can produce that medicine and sell that medicine. And they will sell it at a very high price because the markup makes them extra profit. Now, this is an Ec 101 little slide here. How does a monopolist decide what price to charge? Right? If you charge a price that is very, very high, you will have no customers. If you lower the price, you get more customers, but you have to always watch whether you aren't losing more by reducing your profit margin than you are gaining by adding additional customers. Now, I can't leave the mic, but you can see here maybe if I don't talk, I can do it. So your profit is this area here. It's the rectangle. If you look at the various prices, you try to anticipate the demand curve and then try to maximize the rectangle. So here you can see if you go lower, you get a little more width, but you lose a lot of height. And so you're trying to find the optimal price. And when the demand curve is shaped like this, when a lot of people are quite poor and cannot afford the medicine, even if they need it to save their lives, then it may make sense for a monopolist simply to exclude those 85% and just to say, okay, I'm willing to forget about these 85% as customers because trying to reach them or more of them is not going to be worth the reduction in my markup, in my profit margin. So the great inequality in the world today causes pharmaceutical companies to raise the price so high that the vast majority of human beings cannot afford the medicine so long as it is still under patent. So that's the first drawback, that we are suffering a big loss in diffusion. Many people cannot get the medicine that may be important to save their lives. Now, secondly, the present system also, and for very similar reasons, does very poorly in terms of targeting. So there are many diseases that predominantly poor people have. So malaria, schistosomiasis, and so on, you all know which diseases those are. And those diseases are not really worth researching because even if you are successful in finding a new medicine for that disease, you then face a Hobson's choice of either selling that medicine at a low price, i.e. at much lower than the usual very high markup that you get for other products, or selling it with the usual markup, in which case most of your customers will not be able to afford the medicine. So that means that pharmaceutical companies find it much more profitable to research relatively trivial diseases that are present among the rich, take hair loss as an example, or skin irregularities or something like that, than to research very important diseases that are quite common among poor people. There are other targeting problems, for example, that pharmaceutical companies spend a lot of money and effort developing Me Too drugs, a third or fourth or fifth or sixth statin, for example. They all do pretty much the same job, but you can still make enormous amounts of money by bringing yet another statin onto the market, because you can gain market share through advertising from a competing firm and then also sell it at a very high markup during the patent period. And then there is the preference for maintenance drugs. Drugs can be loosely categorized into three groups, namely those that get a disease out of your body or cures, those that prevent the disease from entering your body, or preventative medicines like vaccines, and then those in between that simply make you feel and function better, but do not actually eradicate the disease in your body. Those third types of drugs are the ones on which pharmaceutical companies make by far the greatest profits under the present system, because they have a customer for life, so to speak, right? So long as the patient doesn't die and also doesn't get better, that patient will come back to the pharmacy buying the medicine again and again and again. So again, the present system tilts the deliberations of pharmaceutical companies in the direction of maintenance drugs towards Me Too drugs that the world really doesn't need. We don't need a seventh or eighth statin. And also towards the diseases that rich people have and away from often much more severe and widespread diseases that are concentrated among poor people. Now, there's a third drawback of the present system, which is in some sense an optimistic drawback, namely it's also a pretty stupid system. It's a system that wastes a lot of money. A rough and quick way to see that is just to think about how much money the world spends on medicines. It's a little under $1 trillion a year, so 860, 880, something like that. And that money, most of that money, does not actually go back into the production of medicine or into innovation, into researching new medicines. That's what we would want, right? We would want the money that we spend on medicines to go right back into their production or into innovation. But a lot of money goes, for example, for advertising, a lot of money goes for litigation, and so the present system also wastes the majority of the money that we are all spending on medicines. And so we have an interest, quite apart from whether we care about the poor or not, to want our pharmaceutical innovation system to be designed differently in such a way that it is more efficient, that more of the money that we put in actually goes to work for us in terms of producing medicine and innovating. So is there any way in which we can do better? When you talk with pharmaceutical executives and you complain about the high prices, what they will always say is, well, what do you want? You want to go back to the Middle Ages? You want to have no pharmaceutical innovation? Innovation is expensive. We need to get paid. And that just unfortunately means that we have to have high prices for medicines. Now, that's the conclusion that I want to dispute. I want to say, yes, we do need to reward innovation because innovation is expensive, especially the clinical trials with high failure rates and so on. But it doesn't follow from the fact that we need to reward innovators, that we need to reward them by giving them patent-protected large markups on their products. There are other ways of rewarding them, much more efficient ways, and also, morally speaking, much more appealing ways. So here's an example, the Health Impact Fund, which I've been working on with colleagues for a while. And let me explain how that would work. So the Health Impact Fund is a complement to the TRIPS agreement. It doesn't actually change the TRIPS agreement. And that's important because it's a WTO agreement which can be changed only with unanimous consent by all the WTO members, something that is not easy to attain, to put it mildly. So the Health Impact Fund would leave the TRIPS agreement as it is, and it would offer an option to pharmaceutical innovators, namely the option to register any new medicine that they develop for health impact rewards. So these rewards would come to the pharmaceutical innovator who registers his or her product on an annual basis for a period of 10 years, and they would come out of a reward pool that gets divided each year among all the registered products in proportion to the health impact that each of these products achieves. So if you have a product on the Health Impact Fund and your product accounts for 8% of the health impact of all the registered products in a given year, you get 8% of the whole pool in that year. The pool is sort of, let's say, $6 billion or so to fix ideas. That repeats, this getting a certain percentage of the pool repeats for a period of 10 years, and at the end of the 10 years, you've had your reward and your medicine goes generic. This is, if you like, a private contract between the Health Impact Fund, which is supposed to be newly created, and pharmaceutical innovators. No pharmaceutical innovator is forced to register a product. It's a voluntary agreement between the innovator and the Health Impact Fund. So the system would then be a two-track system rather than the one-track system that we have now. Currently, the only way in which a pharmaceutical innovator can be rewarded for their effort is by charging high prices from people who need the medicine. It's the only way you get your money back that you've invested in research and development. Here there would be a two-track system where you could have the old track still available. You could insist on your patent and get high markups on your product. Or you could also register with the Health Impact Fund and then get these health impact rewards. Now, the Health Impact Fund would be funded in the first instance by governments, and that means ultimately, of course, by taxpayers. But taxpayers also get something back. Namely, they get to enjoy brand new medicines at very low prices. Because obviously, if somebody registers a medicine with the Health Impact Fund, they cannot then also get the other reward, namely the high markup reward. Anybody who registers a product with the Health Impact Fund must promise to sell it at cost. In particular, the lowest feasible average cost of manufacture and distribution. How do we know that? How do we know what the lowest feasible cost is? We basically ask the innovator to put the manufacture of the product out for tender among competing manufacturers and then to accept the lowest bid, the cheapest manufacturer who can reliably produce the product. They get the contract, they deliver the product in the requisite quantities to the innovator, and the innovator then sells them onward to wholesalers and so on at exactly that same price. So the innovator makes no money whatsoever on the production and sale of the medicine, makes all the money on the health impact rewards for that 10-year reward period, which corresponds roughly to the 10 or so years that a patentee has to make money on the other track. Because the patent clock begins to tick when you apply for the patent, and normally people have about 10 years or so left of the 20 by the time they get market clearance from the FDA or its equivalent. So that would be the alternative way, the Health Impact Fund way of doing it. I'll show you a list of endorsers of the Health Impact Fund idea. You can see that a lot of pretty prominent people have decided that this is a good idea that at least ought to be studied, and I'll say a little bit more about piloting in a moment. But let's first summarize the advantages of the Health Impact Fund, in particular in the three areas where I earlier said that the TRIPS agreement is quite flawed. The first advantage, looking at price or access or diffusion, is that all the products that are registered with the Health Impact Fund would be available at very low prices from day one. Medicines are not expensive at all to produce, right? You have barrels of APIs, of basically the raw chemicals, and you just need a factory that puts them together into pills or whatever form they are being sold in. And the marginal cost of producing an extra pill is ridiculously small. So pretty much all of the high prices that we pay at the pharmacy, $80, $120 per package and so on, are markup by the pharmaceutical innovator, justified by the fact that they did a lot of work on innovation and clinical trials and so on. So cheap medicines that even poor people could afford is the first very important advantage of the Health Impact Fund system. Secondly, you would also end the neglect of the diseases that are concentrated among the poor, because that is where a lot of health impact can be harvested, if you like. So if you look at the world today and look where the greatest deficits in human health are, they are among the poor. Malaria kills a lot of people prematurely, so does tuberculosis, so does AIDS, of course. Many people die from other diseases that you probably haven't heard of, like schistosomiasis, leishmaniasis, Buruli ulcer, and so on. And these are very significant slices of the global burden of disease that have not been addressed very much by pharmaceutical innovators and would be addressed if these innovators could be paid in accordance with health impact and wouldn't have to be paid through markups. And here, developing country manufacturers and research firms would be at an advantage. They would be at an advantage because patient populations are right there and available, and most importantly, because the great big brand name pharma companies of the West, the Pfizers and Mercks and Bayers, haven't really researched these diseases at all. If you are a fledgling company in a developing country and you try to compete with the big guys in terms of cancer, good luck to you, because they have spent billions already on cancer research, and they've got molecule libraries a mile long that already have to be reproduced by you, because they're not going to share them with you. So you have to do all this work again in order to reach the cutting edge. But with regard to the diseases of developing countries, you could pretty quickly get to the research frontier. And so here, developing country research outfits are at much less of a disadvantage and can compete more easily. Good, and then the third point was cost effectiveness. And here again, the Health Impact Fund would greatly boost cost effectiveness as measured by how much of the money that we put into the system by buying medicines or by funding the Health Impact Fund would actually go right back into innovation and manufacturing. And all these different costs would be reduced. Patenting would be reduced because you wouldn't need a patent in many jurisdictions, because nobody would want to compete with you if you sell the product at a very, very low price. Litigation, which is a very, very large expenditure now for pharma companies and generic companies, would mostly go by the wayside, because again, there would be very little reason to litigate over the end of the patent period, because the medicine is already being sold very cheaply, and generic companies could not get a great benefit by getting into the market quickly. Marketing, again, a very big expense now. Companies are advertising, so if they have Me Too drugs, for example, 5 or 6 equivalent medicines, how do you get market share? Well, by advertising. And advertising doesn't just include TV ads and stuff, it also includes inviting doctors to expensive trips and giving them little gifts and so on, and trying to make sure that they prescribe your statin rather than somebody else's statin. And of course, all the money that you spend on increasing your market share will be matched by what the other companies are spending to prevent you from increasing your market share, to defend their market share. So a lot of that expenditure is pure waste, and unless you are an advertising executive or a lawyer, you will have to say that saving that money would be a very good thing. Counterfeiting is another problem with the present system, that because medicines are very expensive, there are, especially in developing countries, lots of counterfeiters who will sell you something that looks like the real thing, but isn't. It's a pill that has the same shape and so on, has a little stamp on it, but it doesn't have the active ingredient in it, or if it does have the active ingredient, it has a much diluted amount. And that's actually positively dangerous, because by giving people a diluted version of the medicine, you will create drug resistance to that particular medicine, because it is not strong enough to kill the pathogens, and the surviving ones will be more resistant to this particular medicine than the ones who succumb to it. So you're breeding drug-resistant versions of the disease. Gaming that is exemplified by brand name pharmaceutical companies, for example, paying money to generic companies not to enter the market, and thereby allowing them, the brand name company, to keep prices artificially high. And lobbying, again, there's an endless amount of lobbying about getting accelerated approval for drugs and so on and so forth. And finally, deadweight losses, simply the phenomenon that a huge number of profitable sales for the company do not come about because they are between the monopoly price that the company has chosen and the cost of the company. And so if the company, for example, sells the product at $100 per package and produces it at $2 a package, there are many mutually advantageous trades that could take place where it would sell at $60, still make $58 profit, but the company can't do that because it would thereby undermine its optimal monopoly price. So all these mutually advantageous trades get lost to the world. So the wastefulness of the system is enormous, and the Health Impact Fund track would avoid all that waste. It has one additional bonus, and that is that the Health Impact Fund would also help with alleviating the last mile problems in drug delivery. So getting drugs to patients, having the patient purchase the drug, is one part of the pipeline, but afterwards there's still a lot of other stuff. Namely, does the patient take the medicine at the right times, with food, without food? Does the patient stay the course? Does the patient go all the way to the end of the medicine, take it for 2 weeks, 8 weeks, in tuberculosis even longer, which is totally crucial, because if you don't do it, you will just create drug resistance. So all these last mile problems of getting the medicine into the villages and also getting the patients fully to comply, these are problems that pharmaceutical companies ordinarily have very little interest in, because once the drug is sold, once it's crossed the counter, the pharmaceutical company has gotten its money and its profit, and it doesn't care whether you, the customer, will flush it down the toilet, whether you will take it, whether you'll feed it to your dog, whether you lose it, it doesn't matter. But with the Health Impact Fund, nothing matters more, because you don't get paid at all for selling the medicine. You get paid for the medicine actually making a health gain possible, and that gets measured, and so statistically sampled. And so the only way you can make money on the Health Impact Fund track is by actually improving people's health. And so pharmaceutical companies will take an interest, if they have products on the Health Impact Fund, in trying to make patients comply with the drug regimen, in making sure that patients know how to take the medicine, that they take the full course, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the examples. And that would be nice, wouldn't it, if pharmaceutical companies really had a financial interest in making you better as a customer. That would be important even in rich countries, and even more so in poor ones. Quickly about the financing, willing governments could contribute something like 0.03% of gross national income. Actually, 0.01% would be enough if all governments participated, but let's assume that only governments accounting for a third of the entire product of the world would contribute, and then you would need more from each. And they would do that maybe with long-term maturity bonds or perpetual bonds in some way in proportion to their gross national product. One could also think of an international tax, which has been much talked about, like a Tobin tax or financial transaction tax that could work. And what I envisage in the long run would be an endowment, where you would have a large amount of money, and you would, from the dividends or interest income on that money or capital gains or whatever it is, you would then feed the Health Impact Fund. That would give you a big cushion against unreliable funding partners, for example, and would also allow you to receive money from foundations, from people who leave something in their will for the Health Impact Fund, and so on. So it would work a little bit like Quinnipiac in terms of having an endowment and paying some of its bills from the proceeds from that capital. Now, piloting, we've just had 2 pretty big successes. Recently, we had a few weeks ago got 2 million euros from the European Union that will help us with piloting and with establishing especially an informational baseline for piloting. So we can go and, in the piloting area, which is in India, look at what the present treatment is before a new drug gets introduced. And the second good news was that a company called Janssen, which developed, actually they didn't develop it themselves, but they bought the patent, or bought the whole company. Tibotec developed a new TB drug. Tibotec is a South African company. Janssen bought Tibotec and thereby acquired the patent. And the drug is called bedaquiline, or Saturo is the brand name. And so this brand new TB drug, pretty much the first such drug to come onto the market in about 50 years, has enormous potential in curing people with MDR TB, multi-drug resistant TB, a very nasty form of TB which with conventional drugs is pretty much untreatable or very difficult to treat. So we have this new drug now, and we can use it only in those cases where the old drugs fail. And of course, we have to use it very, very carefully, make sure that every single person who gets it really gets cured. Because if somebody doesn't get cured, then a resistant strand of tuberculosis, resistant even to this new drug, bedaquiline, may survive in that patient, and then anybody coming into contact with that patient may get that particular version of TB. So what we want to do in the pilot is to measure the impact of the introduction of Serturo in the Mumbai area, where there is a lot of MDR-TB, and also make sure that the susceptibility to Serturo is preserved, that no drug resistance builds up. The drug has been approved by the FDA, but it hasn't yet been approved in India. We expect that to happen near the end of this year or early next year. And we are now establishing a baseline, how present treatment is working, so that we can then, as soon as the drug is approved, distribute it and see how much better it works than existing treatments. So that was about medicines. That's sort of the area in which we've done most work so far. I'll quickly extend it to foodstuffs, agriculture. So progress in agriculture is also hugely important, right? We couldn't have fed anything even remotely like 7.2 billion people that we are now feeding with the agricultural technologies that were available even 200, 300 years ago, when the world's population was more like 1 billion or less. So it's very, very important, and these innovations have allowed us greatly to increase the nutrient yield that we get per acre or per given inputs. So this progress needs to continue if we want to keep hunger at bay. Many people are hungry today, many people are malnourished, and that problem can only get worse if population increases, as it does at the rate of nearly 100 million per year, and food production remains as efficient or inefficient as it is. We also need innovation in agriculture to reduce these enormous quantities of pesticides, fertilizers, methane gas, and antibiotics that are now released into the environment. So if we can do agriculture in a way that is less polluting in these ways, that would again be enormous progress. Now, the fatal mistake that we make in agriculture is quite similar to the fatal mistake that we make with pharmaceuticals. Namely, here too, we encourage innovation, which is good, but we encourage it with temporary monopolies. So agricultural innovations get patents. Patents enable the innovator to charge a high price, and the high price then hampers diffusion. So exactly the same problem. And that is aggravating malnutrition because often more efficient ways of doing agriculture do not diffuse, are not used, especially in the developing countries. And also, which is bad for us, we are not making full use of those innovations that could reduce the use of pesticides, fertilizers, could reduce the emission of methane gas and the use of antibiotics. So an analogous solution is pretty obvious. Again, we should reward and incentivize innovation, but we should do it in a way that does not raise the price of these innovations, that does not charge licensing fees for the use of these innovations. So give innovators the option to be rewarded on the basis of measurable impact of the innovation, the gains that the innovations produce in terms of higher nutrient yields, in terms of reduced pesticide use, fertilizer use, antibiotic use, methane emission, and so on. Reward them on that basis on condition that they license their innovation for free. So the innovator says to the whole world, anybody can use my innovation, it's free for anyone, and actually the more people use it, the better for me, because the larger is the impact of that innovation and the more money I get. And this would again be publicly funded reward money, where we can, through democratic deliberation, decide how much it is worth to us to have less pollution in the atmosphere, less pollution in the oceans with fertilizers and pesticides, and so forth. Now, the idea can also be extended to environmental innovation, where again we have the very same dilemma and the same paradox. Innovation is, of course, crucial for the environment. We want to get away from a fossil fuel-based economy. We want to find alternative fuels that are renewable. And for that, we need new ideas, innovation, more efficient solar panels, hybrid cars, and so on and so forth. But again, anybody who does an innovation in these areas gets a patent, and the patent, the only way to make use of the patent is to charge licensing fees. And so what you find is that the most efficient solar panels are not actually used in China and in India because they're too expensive. Hybrid cars are not being used in India and China because they're too expensive, because you have to pay for the patents in order to put that technology into cars. And that is, frankly speaking, pretty stupid, because we all are suffering from the effects of the pollution that is turned out by antiquated power plants, antiquated car designs, and so forth. Solar panels that are not effective enough, and so forth. So for the sake of relatively small gains, namely we don't make a lot of money on the patents in the developing world, we are hampering very dramatically the diffusion of these innovations and thereby supporting the diffusion of something else, namely the pollution, the extra pollution that these green technologies could avert. So again, we can adapt the solution that we saw in pharmaceuticals, even in this area of the environment. We should give green innovators the option to register, at the least the option, to register their innovations for publicly funded rewards that are based on how much environmental impact, positive environmental impact, the innovation produces, on condition that the innovation is licensed at zero cost. I conclude with a final thought, and that is that the people who suffer the most from the not very intelligent way in which we reward innovation are the poor, because they are the ones who don't get the innovations. They are the ones where the price factor is the greatest obstacle to getting access to innovations. They don't get the new drugs because they can't afford them. They also don't get the pollution control equipment. They don't get the more efficient agricultural products and so forth, because they're poor, because they can't afford them. And being poor, they're also more vulnerable and less able to protect themselves against the effects of, for example, global warming. So many more people remain poor and die prematurely because of this silly way of rewarding innovation that we now have. That, again, is foolish from another point of view, because poverty is the main driver of overpopulation. So those of us who care about the environment, care about the future of humanity, want, of course, to keep the human population at reasonable levels. If you look at predictions now about what population will be in 2100, you find that the predictions vary between 6 and 16 billion. It all depends on what total fertility rates are going to be, how many children is the average woman going to have in the future in this period between now and 2100. And here again, there's a very high, remarkably high correlation between poverty and total fertility rates. You see it here. These are total fertility rates over the last 50 years or so. And you can see that in some countries they've come down dramatically, and in other countries they've stayed persistently high. And you can see which are which, right? The countries that have made progress against poverty, total fertility rates have dropped dramatically. Example, Colombia, Botswana, the most successful case in Africa, where poverty has disappeared largely, or at least become much better. And then you have cases like Equatorial Guinea, where poverty is still rampant, Niger, where total fertility rates are still around 7, which means the average woman has 7 surviving children. So again, if we care about the environment, we must care about future population. If we care about future population, we would be very wise to care about poverty, because poverty and the reduction of poverty is the best thing that we can do to keep population under control. These are the top countries in terms of total fertility rates. You can see they're pretty much all very poor countries in Africa. And here are the countries, about 100 countries that are already below 2 in terms of their total fertility rate. 2 is obviously the rate of stable population reproduction. And you can see that these countries are upper middle class countries, upper middle income countries, and high income countries. And we could dramatically reduce total fertility rates also in Africa if we could reduce poverty, which I'm saying we can do, for one thing, through rewarding innovation in a way that supports better diffusion. Good, that's it. Thank you. So should I take questions or should somebody?
Dr. Pogge is going to take questions, and I'm going to let you choose the person to ask, so it won't look like anybody's playing favorites.
Good, behind the veil of ignorance.
Very good. Who
Yeah.
has questions?
I just have one. I think it's really, it's crucial to get new innovation into the developing world. But it seems now that a greater problem we have is dissemination of even third generation innovation. I mean, the problem is that the innovations we already have that are legally available, economically available, just can't be disseminated because of the lack of infrastructure to do it. How might this address that end of the problem?
Yeah, good question. And you're completely right about that. So there's lack of infrastructure. There's also often a lack of incentives. So take a medicine that is off patent, like aspirin. Aspirin is just too cheap for anybody to take the trouble to disseminate it in the developing countries. The profit margin is too small. There are too many competing companies doing it. And so it doesn't reach people in the developing world for that reason. Well, the answer is that if you have an incentive that is based on the impact, then of course you have a very strong reason that is quite separate from the low price of the product to get the product out there. So for example, you have a new malaria drug, right? And that malaria drug is really good and it saves lives. And saving a life means you get 16, 20 QALYs for each person whose life you save because that person lives a lot longer. So you can make a very considerable reward on saving that person's life. And that is the incentive for you as the innovator to try to find local partners, to do whatever it takes. Get refrigerators there to keep the medicine cold if that's what's needed, and so on. You will basically be on the right side of development. You will say, suddenly, for the first time, poor people are interesting. They're lucrative. I can make money off poor people. I can actually, by bringing them better health care or by reducing the pollution that they produce in their agriculture or whatever, I can actually make a real profit. Yes, please.
So when you were talking about the health fund, why would a pharmaceutical company, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry a year, why would they make the switch and go to something where they would only be making profits if they succeeded? Why would they be encouraged to do that when they could be making billions?
So first of all, the success condition exists even on the other track. So if you don't succeed, if the FDA turns down your drug because it's not safe or not effective, sorry, you've just wasted your entire investment. And that happens all the time in the pharmaceutical industry. But of course, you're right that they make a lot more money, and they would, on my two-track system, make a lot more money on the patent track with things like hair loss medicine than they would make with malaria and so on. Why would they do it? Simply because they don't have to abandon the first track in order to switch to the second. With each drug, you have a choice. We have to be on one track or the other. But the fact that you have a few drugs on the Health Impact Fund track doesn't preclude you having other drugs on the patent track. So it's a little bit like when you ask, why does Mercedes-Benz make the smart car? Have you seen the smart car? That little thing? Okay, why do they make the smart car? They make so much more money on the Mercedes 500 sedan, Why do they make the smart car? Well, they make the smart car because they make money on the smart car. They're not stopping the other production of the Mercedes 500, the big sedan, right, with a big profit margin. But there are lots of people out there on whom you can still make profit, who would never buy the 500, So you sell them the smart car, you make a little profit. You hire additional engineers if you have to, or additional factory workers and so on. And the same would happen with the pharma companies. They would continue to do what they're doing, selling to rich people pretty meaningless drugs that don't have much health impact, that would never be worth registering with a health impact fund. But in addition, they would say, why not also get that little money that we can get on the health impact fund? And in addition, there's another thing about pharma companies. They have a bit of an image problem, have you noticed? So they are not much better liked than the arms dealers and the tobacco firms. And that is surprising because they have a product that we all need and that is important, right? They should be much better liked than they are. And so pharmaceutical companies would like to be better liked. It's politically good for them to be better liked. And so here they have a way that is profitable, not very profitable, but profitable, to do something good that gets them off the hook with regard to doing more for poor populations, basically. So I think they would bite. And if they don't, if the big ones don't, you would still have smaller ones in the developing world. You would still have public-private partnerships. There are other pharmaceutical innovators, NGO-type innovators, that would certainly want to register. The money wouldn't just stay on the table unclaimed. Good. Yes, please.
The dissemination of the monies to companies depends upon measurement of outcomes and other data, which to the layman like me seems like a very, very complicated affair. So I would imagine companies getting in want to, if you're, again, you're spending all this money on innovation, but you want to go in this direction, you want some confidence that you're going to be treated fairly and that the outcomes are measured properly. You've probably studied this, so can you talk about this a little bit?
Sure, and you're right that it is very complicated, but there are a few nice features about it. One nice feature is that we cannot cheat the pharma companies because the entire pot gets divided among them. So it's not a game where the Health Impact Fund plays against the pharmaceutical innovators, but rather they play against each other, if you like. They compete for slices, and the Health Impact Fund is basically the umpire that decides what percentage of the health impact achieved by all these drugs is due to your drug that you registered with the Health Impact Fund. Now, with regard to the precision of the measurement, you're completely right that precision is very hard to achieve there, because you cannot trace every single package of medicine to the end user and then wait and see what happens to the patient and so on. You have to work with statistical methods, a little bit like exit polls after elections, right? Quinnipiac is the leading institution for that, I think. So what you do is you ask 2,000 or 3,000 Americans when they come out of the polling booth, how have you voted tonight? And you know how the country has voted if you have properly selected your 3,000 people. And that's pretty remarkable, the power of statistics. You know how big your error is, you can predict that even. And so that's what we would do. We would very carefully look at a certain fraction of the patients who got that medicine, and we would see how they fared, and of course establish a baseline with regard to the treatments that were available before the new treatment came onto the market that we are now rewarding. So that's how it would basically work. There would be some error, some margin of error, but pharmaceutical companies would understand that that's a necessary part of the system, and sometimes they would gain and sometimes they would lose a little bit, right? Sometimes their impact would be overestimated, sometimes it would be underestimated. In the long run, over all the drugs and all the countries and all the years, this would come out in the wash, more or less. Yeah?
I'd like to consider agriculture for a second, in particular case in point, Monsanto. Now they seem to have a business plan that is about creating and maintaining a permanent monopoly. And can you walk us through a scenario that you envision where they would change if that was indeed their approach, and how they might buy into what you're proposing? And then I have a second question involving short-term market-driven, for example, once again, in agricultural products in future markets that can be driven dramatically by the behavior of big players like hedge funds, and have had real impact, notably not that long ago with rice, the cost of rice, and other grains that have huge impacts on subsistence economies.
Yeah, so I think that with regard to both problems, this may not be the full solution. So with regard to Monsanto, right, I understand that this is the business model that they're driving. They try to get a kind of permanent dependence where they get a slice of production and distribution for all future time. They say we have the seed, and the seed is developed each year. It's sort of slightly different and so on, and try to make farmers dependent on a seed that they have patent rights to, and thereby secure themselves a payment each and every year for the indefinite future. Insofar as that business model is legal and works, they would not have much of an incentive to switch over into anything like an agricultural impact fund, sort of an equivalent to the health impact fund. So the problem here is, and I showed this in connection with the health impact fund as well, that if you take the present legal structure for granted and assume for the moment that you cannot change the TRIPS agreement because it is so very difficult to change, then you will have the problem that you have to bring people over to your impact reward track with carrots rather than with sticks. You can't force people over. The only thing you can do is lure them over and say, here's another way for you to make profit. And if you register, you can do, get money in some other way. But if they are deeply entrenched on their route and make a lot of money on their route, there's nothing you can really do. So it's similar with cancer drugs, for example, where people might say, well, we are just going to stay with our true and trusted business model with cancer drugs. We'll charge very high prices, and too bad for these 85% of the world's population who cannot afford $30,000 a year for a cancer drug. Right? The money is just too good. And even more so with the futures markets, right? Futures markets is a totally different problem from this innovation problem that I had here outlined. This solution doesn't offer any solace for futures markets, right? What happened in these years between 2006 and 2010, basically, was that there was a lot of some scarcity of food that was real, that was caused by natural disasters of one sort or another, and also the ethanol requirement that a lot of corn that the US is producing was put into fuel production. And then speculators, anticipating that, were bidding up the prices, so the price swings were much larger than they would normally have been given these market factors. Again, the only thing I can say is that if we had more nutrition produced in the world through the better diffusion of new technologies, then that would dampen maybe, at least for a time, speculation, because they would then be, the objective market factors would not be so lopsided. It wouldn't be the case that there would be real scarcities. But it's a different problem for which a different solution needs to be found, basically. Yeah.
I'm much intrigued by the idea of the health impact fund, and I was wondering about how it connects with either, or perhaps in terms of collaboration or facilitation with other efforts for increasing health, like the Millennium Development Goals, which have defined very specific targets and have involved considerable effort at reducing the incidence of a number of the diseases we were talking about. So I'd just be interested in knowing more of what has happened in terms of collaboration, if any, or what the potential is in terms of also global political organizations in either facilitating or, especially since with the Millennium Development Goals, there was a tremendous consensus in the global community about the necessity of such goals from a normative perspective, but also from a political and economic perspective.
Yeah, so I'm not as enthusiastic about the MDGs as maybe you are, but I think the MDGs, there is a consensus, right? The consensus says we want disease to go down, we want poverty to go down, we want hunger to go down, but what we need is not a consensus on these wishes. What we need is a consensus about who has to do what to make it happen. And what the MDGs have disintegrated into, in my view, is a kind of horse race where we, the rich West, is looking down onto Africa and we are saying, well, Senegal seems to have the nose in front and Kenya is coming up from behind. And, we're basically saying that what it means to halve hunger, or what it means to reduce maternal mortality or whatever, means every country has to reduce it in its own jurisdiction, right? And so the country that started out with 80% hunger has to reduce it down to 40%, even though it is an incredibly poor country. And the upper middle class country that started out with 0.5% hunger has to get it down to 0.25%, right? Very easy to do. So what we need, I think, is to move to goals that are genuine goals, that are attached to agents where we say this agent, and competent agent, an agent with money and with abilities, has to do this or that in order to get these deplorable poverty numbers, hunger numbers, disease numbers down. And here the Health Impact Fund is precisely the new kind of goal, right? Instead of saying, let's all agree that hunger should be halved, or let's all agree that this should go down, and let's all agree that the weather should be good tomorrow, sure. But instead of that, what we should do is let's do something concrete where the rich countries who are much more able support something like the Health Impact Fund in order to actually make it happen. So it's, in a sense, it goes towards the wishes, but in a way that's much more concrete and tangible. Anat.
Thanks. I have two questions, and I'm not sure they're related. One is a presupposition that we had here from the title, Designing for Human Rights. I think I got the design, and I got the fact that you designed a model that answers three very different questions in three areas. But which human rights exactly are you talking about? And I know that, I know we can point to certain human rights in those lists that we have, but how does human rights figure here as a conceptual basis for what you're doing? And the second question is directly related is why, I think maybe it was even one of the titles, why should we care about the poor and who are we? You said sometimes we don't want fertility rates up. There's a sub-question in there. The correlation between fertility and poverty, where's the cause and effect? I mean, which direction does that correlation go? But forget the sub-question. The big question is, who are the we that are charged with worrying about the poor? Anybody, anywhere in the world, this sort of connects with Annalise's question. Who's going to regulate and ask and formulate the goals for that we who want millennial goals or whatever it is that we want?
Right, so start with the human rights. The first human right I would mention is Article 28 in the Universal Declaration, right? Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. So the idea here is that we now have, and that's what I try to show, we have a social and international order under which human rights are widely unfulfilled, in particular social and economic human rights, right, which are by far the least realized human rights of all. It's literally billions of people, probably the bottom half of the human population, bottom in terms of poverty, the poorer half of the human population with less than 3% of global income, pretty much all of those people lack secure access to the objects of their social and economic human rights. And that I trace back to a design of international institutions that is driven by a small global elite without any concern for how that impacts the poor. And innovation is one example, right? This was pushed by 4 powerful industries in the United States who went to Clinton and first agreed among themselves and then went to Clinton and said, this is the TRIPS agreement that we want you to bring home as part of the WTO negotiations. And the industries were agriculture, pharmaceutical, entertainment, and software. Those were the very, very big industries, very powerful industries. And they basically gave it to Clinton. Clinton then demanded it in international negotiations. And so we got this agreement, which is obviously a very pernicious agreement for the poor of the world. So that's the key thing. So we have a responsibility as the designers. The United States plays a very important role in designing these international institutions. It's the big power in international negotiations. We have a responsibility to see to it that these international institutions are at least human rights compliant. That is to say that they at least do not produce an excess, an avoidable excess of human rights under fulfillment by being designed in such a way that poverty is excessive, much larger than it needs to be, and so on. And that's currently not the case. So I think we have a human rights-based responsibility to rectify these institutions, to make them human rights compliant, to make them such that human rights deficits are kept as low as they can reasonably be kept by institutional design. So that's the main argument. And then, of course, I make subsidiary arguments because not everybody is susceptible to a human rights argument. Some people will say, well, okay, so fine. So we have international institutions that are good for us and are terrible for the rest of the world. So what? That's all right. I don't care. And then it's worth pointing out, but they're also very wasteful. They're also not in your own long-term interest. They're also going to cause excess pollution, ecological problems in the future, and so on, overpopulation. So these are subsidiary arguments that, as far as I'm concerned, one could leave to one side, but which are good. I mean, given that they work, it's good to have them in the mix in order to strengthen the appeal of that argument. So the we that I address is basically the population of the developed countries, and in particular those developed countries that have a significant role in shaping the institutional design of our global institutional order. So the United States, first and foremost, as the dominant power in shaping these institutions. And then about the cause and effect thing, you're saying that there is also a feedback effect, namely that people with a lot of children will also thereby be impoverished. But I think that just heightens the causality that I'm emphasizing, which goes in the opposite direction, because that's something that poor people know and understand. Poor people are getting a lot of children, not because they want to be poor, they want to have a lot of economic burdens and so on, but they get a lot of children because of 2 reasons. One is that they feel that when they get old, if they don't have surviving children, nobody will look after them. They need to have surviving children as the only age insurance, so to speak. And secondly, because they understand that infant mortality is very high, child mortality is very high. And so if you want to have surviving children when you reach age 50 or 60 and can't work anymore, then you better have a lot of children in order to make sure that some of them survive. As soon as you take these fears away, as soon as, like Lula did when he paid a pension to retired sharecroppers, as soon as you give people the assurance that they will be taken care of in old age, and lift them out of poverty in that way, take their fears away, reduce infant mortality and so on, people's total fertility rates drop very precipitously, as we saw in all different cultures all across the world.
One question up in the balcony from a student there.
Good.
Yes, so the rewards for companies or pharmaceutical companies or agricultural innovation, those are apparent that joining and putting their products into the EIF or things like that. And the rewards for smaller or developing countries, they are, their countries will grow. Are there any incentives beyond the overall wellness of the human race for larger countries and more
Yeah, so in the case of the environmental impact, it is pretty clear, right? Many of the examples that I gave in agriculture were environmental. So if fertilizers get released into the world, pesticides get released, antibiotics get released into, I mean, there's a lot of antibiotics now in our water supply already. Methane gas gets released. All of these releases are bad for us. And so we have a self-interested reason in supporting an incentive scheme that would dramatically reduce these emissions or releases into the atmosphere. That would be one reason. In the case of the pure healthcare pharmaceutical innovation, it is probably true that if we did not join that system, we could do maybe as well as we would do by joining. But joining the system, we would, on the one hand, save a lot of the wasteful expenditures that are outlined. So a lot of that excess, at least for all the medicines that would move over, you would save litigation, patenting cost, advertising cost, and so on. And you would, of course, also, as a member of the Health Impact Fund partnership, get the medicine at this very low price. So you, as a taxpayer, would pay something through the tax system, but you would also get less expense when you buy insurance or when you buy medicines in the pharmacy. And then there is, to the extent that you are interested in that human rights argument, there's the human rights thing, right? We have no right to impose upon the world a system that prevents Indian generic companies from supplying Indian patients with cheap medicines. That's, for me, a very important human rights thing. We are actively violating the human rights of Indian citizens by interposing ourselves between companies that are willing and able to produce effective medicines that can save their lives and the patients who need these medicines desperately to survive. We are interposing ourselves by saying, no, India, you have to adopt this monopoly patent regime, just like we have had it, and you have to enforce it, and you have to pay very large amounts of money to our inventor companies at home, even if that means that thousands and even millions of people will die prematurely in India and across the rest of the developing world. So the human rights argument is, I think, the most powerful argument, but these other prudential arguments, it wouldn't cost us very much, right? We are now paying for innovation because we are the ones who are the first users, so to speak, of these medicines. We are the ones who can afford them when they come first on the market. And we would continue to be the main funders of innovation, even under the Health Impact Fund system. The big difference is that if we fund it through high prices, we exclude 85% of humanity. If we fund it through the tax system, we are including all these poor people who can now also get access to advanced medicines.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pogge.